Hey guys, tonight we are going to do something a little different. We're not just going to talk about history, we're going to step right into it. Specifically, into a world of breathtaking art, high society, and a secret ingredient so bizarre. It sounds like something out of a gothic horror novel. Fair warning, though stepping into Victorian London comes with its own set of challenges. The air quality is questionable, and the social etiquette is a minefield. You probably wouldn't last a day, but don't worry, I'll be your guide. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see where our little community gathers from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the fog. It's not the gentle, rolling mist of a quiet countryside morning. This is London fog, the infamous pea souper. It's thick, yellow-grey, and it tastes of coal, smoke and damp earth. It clings to your coat and muffles the world, turning the familiar sounds of a bustling city into a ghostly echo. You can hear the rhythmic clatter of horses' hooves on wet cobblestones, the distant, muffled cry of a street vendor selling roasted chestnuts, and the low, resonant chime of a clock tower somewhere in the shrouded distance. You pull your collar up, the damp chill seeping into your bones, and walk down the Strand. Gas lights flicker uncertainly, casting long, dancing shadows and creating halos of hazy, orange light in the gloom that feels like walking through a dream, or perhaps a watercolor painting that hasn't quite dried yet. Then, you see it, through a break in the swirling miasma. A splash of brilliant, warm light spills out onto the pavement. It's a gallery, the Grosvenor Gallery, its name etched in gold leaf above a grand set of polished oak doors. It stands as an island of clarity and warmth in the murky ocean of the city, drawn by the promise of escaping the cold. You push one of the heavy doors open and step inside. The change is immediate. The air is warm, smelling faintly of beeswax, dried flowers, and oil paint. The oppressive silence of the fog is replaced by the gentle hum of polite conversation, the rustle of silk dresses, and the soft scuff of leather shoes on a polished wooden floor. The gallery is a cavern of treasures. The walls are covered in deep, wine-red fabric, against which hang enormous paintings in ornate, gilded frames. Each one seems to glow with an inner light, a defiant splash of impossible color against the grey world outside. You begin to wander, moving from one canvas to another. These aren't the staid, formal portraits or grand historical scenes you might expect. These are different. They are vibrant, intense, and almost painfully detailed. You see a knight in gleaming armor kneeling in a forest so dense you can almost smell the moss. You see a woman with a cascade of fiery red hair, her expression one of longing and sorrow, her velvet dress rendered with such precision you feel you could reach out and touch its texture. This, you realize, is the work of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. A mainstream history lesson for you. This was a group of young, rebellious artists: William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, among others, who, in the mid-19th century, decided the art world had become lazy. They rejected the classical, idealized poses of Raphael and his followers, and instead aimed to paint with the truth, detail, and intense color of Italian art from before Raphael. Their work was radical, emotional, and utterly captivating. As you drift through the gallery, you overhear snippets of conversation. People murmur about the shocking realism, the luminous colors, the unconventional beauty of the models. It's a good reminder that while we see these as priceless masterpieces today, their reception was initially very mixed. In fact, historians and art critics still debate whether the initial public outrage was a genuine reaction to their radical new style or simply a form of manufactured controversy. A classic case of the establishment feeling threatened by the avant-garde. Charles Dickens himself famously savaged one of Millais' early paintings, so you know the drama was real. You pause in front of a particularly large canvas, a scene from an old legend. The hero's face is cast in shadow, his dark hair a messy tangle. Your eyes, however, aren't on him. They are drawn to the shadows themselves. The deep, rich browns that define the forest behind him. The translucent glaze on an antique wooden table. The raw, earthy tones of a leather-bound book. There's a particular shade of brown here that seems different. It's not flat or opaque like other earth pigments. It has a unique transparency, a sort of inner glow that makes the shadows feel deep and alive, not just dark. It's a color that holds a secret. It's almost as if the artist found a way to paint not just with pigment, but with time itself. You lean closer, captivated. There's a story in their color. You can feel it. A story far older than the canvas it rests on. You're so close to the canvas now that you can see the fine web of cracks in the varnish. Like a delicate map of time spreading across the surface. You can see the individual bristles of the brush, captured forever in the dried paint. This is the magic of the Pre-Raphaelites. They weren't just painting a scene, they were documenting a moment with an almost fanatical devotion to detail. Their guiding principle, their core philosophy, was truth to nature. This was the big mainstream idea that set them apart. It meant no shortcuts. If you were painting a brick wall, you painted every single brick, every chip, every speck of mortar. If you were painting a patch of grass, you would spend weeks rendering each individual blade. You moved to another painting, one depicting a scene from a Keats poem. A young woman, her face pale with sickness, is wrapped in a heavy shawl. You notice her hands. They aren't the delicate, idealized hands of a classical Madonna. They are thin, slightly reddened at the knuckles, with fingernails that are just a little too short. They are real hands. The artists often used their friends, their family, and even themselves as models, refusing to smooth over the imperfections of real life. They wanted the raw emotion, the awkwardness, the authenticity of the human experience. You see it in the worried frown on a character's face, the genuine grief in their eyes, the slump of their shoulders. This was a radical departure from the noble, heroic, and frankly, rather boring figures that dominated the Royal Academy at the time. This obsession with realism led to some rather extreme methods. Here's a little tidbit for you. One of the most famous Pre-Raphaelite paintings is John Everett Millais' Ophelia, showing the tragic character floating in a stream. To achieve the perfect, realistic effect of a body in water, Millais had his model, a young artist named Elizabeth Sid Dow, lie for hours in a bathtub full of water in his studio. To keep the water warm, he placed oil lamps underneath the tub. The sessions went on for months, right into the winter. On one occasion, the lamps went out. Millais, completely engrossed in his work, didn't notice. The water grew icy cold, and Sid Dow, ever the professional, didn't complain. She subsequently caught a severe cold, which developed into pneumonia. Her furious father threatened to sue the artist for medical expenses. A very unbohemian dose of reality. Millais prayed up, but he got his painting, a masterpiece of haunting, watery beauty. All thanks to a very cold bathtub and a very patient model. You glance around the gallery, at the intense, serious faces depicted on the walls and the equally intense, serious faces of the patrons studying them. You think about the name they chose for themselves, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. It sounds so formal, so secretive, like a Masonic lodge for painters. And that's the point that historians still argue about. How much of it was a real, oath-bound secret society, and how much was just youthful branding. They did have a secret journal. They used the initials P.R.B. on their early works as a mysterious signature, and they held meetings to critique each other's work with brutal honesty. But was it a true brotherhood with arcane rituals? Or was it more like an exclusive club for art nerds who were fed up with the establishment and wanted a cool name? The truth is likely somewhere in between. A mix of genuine camaraderie and a clever bit of marketing to create a mystique around their movement. But your mind keeps drifting back to that color. That specific, luminous brown. It's everywhere, now that you're looking for it. It's in the shadows of a velvet curtain, giving it weight and depth. It's in the rich, loamy soil of a freshly plowed field. It's in the polished wood of a lute leaning against a chair. It's the color of old leather, of ancient trees, of things that carry the weight of history. It's so much more versatile than a simple burnt umber or a raw sienna. It has a transparency that allows the layers underneath to shine through, creating a glow that seems to come from within the painting itself. How did they do it? What was this pigment that could be so dark and earthy in one stroke, yet so warm and translucent in another? It's not just a technical question anymore. It's becoming a nagging curiosity. You feel a pull, a desire to understand the very substance of this art, to go beyond the image and find the source of its material soul. The beauty is enchanting, but the mystery of its creation is what truly captures you now. You find yourself standing before a painting by Edward Burne-Jones, a later artist associated with the movement. It's a scene of mythic proportions, a king, asleep in a tangled briar patch, the world frozen around him. The painting is a symphony of details, but you're focused on the color palette, specifically the browns. You see the thorny vines twisting around the sleeping king, and their color is just perfect. It's not the flat brown of dead wood, it has a depth, a richness that suggests age and a strange kind of preservation. It's the color of something that was once alive and is now in a state of suspended animation, perfectly matching the theme of the painting. This quest for the perfect color was central to the Pre-Raphaelite mission. They were, in essence, color theorist nerds. They believed that the bright, gem-like colors of early Renaissance art had been lost, muddied by centuries of academic techniques that favored Chiaroscuro, the dramatic use of light and shadow over pure, vibrant hues. Their solution was radical for the time. They developed a technique of painting on a wet, white ground. This meant applying a thin layer of white paint to the canvas and then, while it was still tacky, applying their colors in thin glazes. The wet white base would reflect light back up through the layers of paint, making the colors appear incredibly luminous, almost like a stained glass window. This is the mainstream historical fact of their technique, the secret to their signature glow. But that still doesn't explain this particular brown. A wet white ground can make a red a blue, but it can't fundamentally change the character of a pigment. This brown pigment had a unique quality all its own. It was notoriously tricky to work with, or so you've heard in hushed whispers. It could be a bit gritty. It didn't always dry evenly, and its permanence was a subject of much debate among core men, the specialized suppliers who mixed and sold pigments to artists. Yet, when it worked, it was magical. It was the perfect color for creating transparent, glowing shadows, for rendering the texture of aged wood, or for giving a richness to the hair of a pensive maiden. It was a high-risk, high-reward pigment. You start to imagine the artist in his studio, a canvas on the easel, a palette in his hand. He needs the perfect brown for the shadow under a jawline, a shadow that isn't just dark, but also warm, hinting at the blood flowing beneath the skin. He reaches for a tube of paint. What is it called? Raw umber to opaque, burnt sienna to reddish. He needs something else, something with history baked into its very essence. This is where you stumble upon a more obscure bit of trivia about the art world of the time. The names of colors were often wonderfully, and sometimes misleadingly, poetic. You had colors like dragon's blood, a deep red resin that, disappointingly, did not come from actual dragons. You had Indian yellow, a vibrant, golden yellow that, for a long time, had a very mysterious origin. It was rumored to be made from the urine of cows fed exclusively on mango leaf. A story so bizarre it was thought to be a myth for decades until scientific analysis in the 20th century proved it was essentially true. The art world was full of these strange recipes and alchemical secrets. So, what was this brown pigment called? Was its name as evocative as dragon's blood? The search for the perfect color was an obsession that drove artists strange places. It wasn't just about matching what they saw in nature. It was about finding pigments that had the right behavior. Did it mix well with oil? Was it transparent or opaque? Did it crack over time? Did it react poorly with other pigments on the palette? This is a debate that still goes on in conservation labs and art history departments. To what extent did the physical properties of available pigments dictate artistic choices? Did artists paint a certain way because of a high-minded aesthetic theory? Or were they simply making the best of the materials they could get their hands on? Perhaps the Pre-Raphaelites would have painted very differently if their local colorman had a different inventory. As you ponder this, a well-dressed gentleman next to you, noticing your intense focus on the painting's shadows, leans in and murmurs, "Exquisite. Isn't it?" Burne-Jones was a master of the glaze. He knew how to make the shadows breathe. You nod, not wanting to break your train of thought. "It's the brown," you say, almost to yourself. "The brown is special." The gentleman smiles, a knowing, slightly conspiratorial smile. "Oh, yes," he says, his voice dropping even lower. "That would be the mummy brown. Unbeatable for fresh tones and shadows. A bit of a bugger to grind, I hear, but worth the effort." He winks, taps the side of his nose, and strolls away, leaving you to process his words. Mummy brown, the name hangs in the air, absurd and unsettling. Surely, that's just a fanciful name, like dragon's blood. It has to be, right? Mummy brown. The name echoes in your head, a bizarre and jarring juxtaposition. You try to dismiss it as a poetic flourish, a marketing gimmick from some clever colorman. After all, you're in a world that calls a shade of red dragon's blood. But the gentleman's knowing wink and the conspiratorial tone of his voice suggest otherwise. Suddenly, the entire gallery feels different. The air, which a moment ago smelled of beeswax and oil paint, now seems to carry a faint, dusty, and vaguely sweet scent you can't quite place. You look away from the paintings and start to observe the people around you, the very fabric of this Victorian society. It's then that you begin to notice a subtle but pervasive theme running through the room, far beyond the gilded frames. A woman passes by, fanning herself with a delicate fan made of painted papiers. On a nearby table, a bronze statuette of the goddess Bastet, in the form of a cat, sits next to a vase of flowers. You catch a snippet of conversation between two gentlemen discussing a recent shipment of antiquities that arrived at the British Museum. One of them proudly mentions a scarab beetle type he acquired from a jeweler on Bond Street. It clicks. You're not just in Victorian London, you're in the throes of full-blown Egyptomania. This is the great historical context of our story. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt at the turn of the 19th century had kicked the whole thing off. His army didn't just bring soldiers, it brought scholars, scientists, and artists who meticulously documented the wonders they found. Their multi-volume work, the Description de l'Egypte, became a sensation across Europe. It was like seeing pictures from another planet. Then, in 1822, Jean-Francois Champollion successfully deciphered the hieroglyphs using the Rosetta Stone, and the floodgates opened. Suddenly, this ancient, silent civilization began to speak, and Europe was utterly mesmerized. Ancient Egypt was everywhere. It was in the architecture, with grand new buildings featuring lotus-topped columns and obelisks in public squares. It was in the fashion, with jewelry and textile patterns borrowing Egyptian motifs. It was in the literature, with stories of curses and revived mummies becoming a popular genre. It was even in the furniture, with chairs and tables designed to look like they'd been plucked straight from a pharaoh's tomb. To be interested in Egypt was to be modern, sophisticated, and intellectual. It was the ultimate status symbol. The 19th century equivalent of having a minimalist Scandinavian-designed home or a collection of rare vinyl. But this fascination had a darker, more intrusive side. It wasn't just about appreciating a culture from afar. It was about possessing it. The demand for authentic Egyptian artifacts was insatiable. Wealthy collectors and national museums sponsored expeditions that were often little more than glorified treasure hunts. Tombs that had been sealed for 3,000 years were blasted open with dynamite. Sacred sites were plundered, their contents crated up and shipped back to London, Paris, and Berlin. This frenzied acquisition was fueled by a sense of colonial entitlement, a belief that these Western powers were rescuing history from the supposedly neglectful locals. Here's a little known, rather grim fact that illustrates the scale of this trade. Ancient mummies were imported into Britain in such vast quantities that they were used for purposes far stranger than sitting in a museum. In the mid-19th century, there was a paper shortage. An American entrepreneur had the bright idea to import mummy wrappings, the linen bandages, to be processed into pulp for making paper. Think about that. People were writing letters, printing newspapers, and making grocery bags out of the sacred funerary linens that had once swaddled the bodies of ancient Egyptians. The project ultimately failed, not due to any moral outrage, but because the linen was too brittle and gummed up with resin to be processed efficiently. It was a commercial failure, not a moral one. Historians still debate the true nature of this Egyptomania. Was it a genuine, albeit clumsy, attempt to understand a lost civilization, a pioneering phase of modern archaeology, or was it simply the ultimate expression of imperial arrogance and cultural theft? The answer, as is often the case, is a messy all of the above. It was a strange cocktail of scientific curiosity, romantic fantasy, and ruthless exploitation. The line between archaeologist and tomb robber was often blurry, if it existed at all. Standing in the gallery, you realized that the Pre-Raphaelite paintings, with their intense realism and romantic themes, were a product of this same cultural moment. They were part of a society that was obsessed with the past, with authenticity, and with a kind of dramatic, melancholic beauty. And this society's obsession with Egypt was so profound that it literally consumed its history, turning sacred objects into drawing room curiosities and, perhaps, even into art supplies. The name Mummy Brown no longer sounds like a fanciful metaphor. It sounds like a literal description. And with that chilling thought, you feel an urge to get some air, to step away from the polished world of the gallery and see where this Egyptian craze leads on the streets of London. You step out of the Grosvenor Gallery, back into the foggy embrace of the London night. The gentleman's words, Mummy Brown, still hang in the air, but now they're tangled up with this new understanding of the city's Egyptian obsession. It feels less like a scholarly interest and more like a fever. If they were making paper from mummy wrappings, what else were they doing? You decide to follow this thread. They short ride in a hansom cab, with the rhythmic galloping of the horse providing a steady beat against the city's hum, takes you from the refined elegance of the West End to a fashionable townhouse in Belgravia. You have an invitation, not to a ball or a musicala, but to something uniquely, bizarrely Victorian, a mummy unwrapping party. Yes, you heard that right. It was a genuine social event. A wealthy individual who had acquired an ancient Egyptian mummy on their travels, or through a dealer, would invite guests to their home for an evening of entertainment, the highlight of which was the public unwrapping of the sarcophagus and its occupant. It was science, spectacle, and a macabre dinner party all rolled into one. You arrive at a grand residence, its windows blazing with gaslight. A butler takes your coat and hat, and you're ushered into a large drawing room packed with men in starched collars and women in elaborate bustled gowns. The air is thick with anticipation and the scent of perfume barely masking the faint, dry, earthy smell that you're beginning to find unnerving wool familiar. In the center of the room, placed on a specially erected trestle table, is a large, anthropoid sarcophagus. It's ornately painted with hieroglyphs and images of gods with animal heads, silent witnesses to this strange foreign ritual. The host, a portly gentleman with impressive sideburns and a great deal of self-importance, stands beside the sarcophagus. He is often a surgeon or a man of science, lending the proceedings an air of academic legitimacy. He gives a short lecture on the history of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the mummification process, and the significance of the symbols on the coffin. It's all very educational. A thin veneer of intellectualism spread over what is essentially public desecration. This is the mainstream historical view of these events. They were a strange intersection of the Victorian passion for empirical knowledge and their insatiable appetite for novelty and sensation. As the host begins his work, a hush falls over the room. With a small crowbar, he pries open the lid of the sarcophagus. There's a creak of ancient wood, a puff of dust that glitters in the gaslight, and a collective gasp from the audience. Inside lies the mummy itself, a human-shaped bundle wrapped tightly in layers of linen, now stained dark brown and yellow with age and the embalming resins. The surgeon takes up a pair of shears and begins to snip away at the bandages. Layer after layer is cotton peeled back, the linen strips piling up on the floor. It's a slow, methodical process, with each layer removed. The anticipation in the room grows. Will they find treasure amulets, jewelry, or papier scrolls tucked within the wrappings were a huge drawer? Here's a curious, slightly ghoulish detail about these events. The host would often give out souvenirs. A guest might go home with a small square of the ancient linen bandage, a bead from a necklace found on the body, or even, in some recorded cases, a lock of hair or a fragmented bone. It's a chilling thought, a piece of a 3-0-year-old person sitting on a mantelpiece in London next to a seashell from Brighton. It highlights the complete objectification of these human remains. They were no longer seen as people, they were artifacts, curiosities, a collection of interesting parts. As the final layers of wrapping come away, the preserved body is revealed. The skin is like dark, dry leather pulled taut over the bones. The room falls silent for a moment, the reality of what they are looking at, a once living person, finally sinking in. But the mood quickly shifts back from awe to scientific curiosity. The surgeon points out the state of the teeth, makes observations about the person's likely age and status, and searches for any signs of disease. It's a full-blown autopsy performed for an audience of socialites. But historians still debate the true motivation behind these parties. Was it really about advancing science, or was it a morbid form of entertainment? A way for the wealthy to confront mortality from a safe, comfortable distance? Was it a demonstration of imperial power unwrapping Egypt itself on a drawing room table? Or perhaps it was something more primal, a deep-seated human curiosity about death, dressed up in the respectable clothes of archaeology and anatomy? There was likely no single reason. It was a complex cultural phenomenon, reflecting a society that was both deeply religious and fascinated by the new frontiers of science. A society that could sentimentalize the death of a child in a Dickens novel while turning the unmaking of an ancient corpse into a party trick. You watch as the remains are examined, discussed, and then eventually set aside. The party moves on. Refreshments are served. The conversation turns to other topics. But you can't help but wonder, what happens next? What happens to the body now that it has served its purpose as entertainment? It's been unwrapped, demystified, and discarded. It's no longer an intact mummy, but a collection of desiccated parts, resin-soaked linen, brittle bones, dried flesh. It has become, in essence, raw material. And as you watch a servant discreetly begin to clear away the pile of dark, stiff bandages, the phrase mummy brown pops into your head again, this time with a dreadful, sickening clarity. The raw material for what? The mummy unwrapping party leaves a strange, dusty taste in your mouth, both literally and figuratively. The image of that unwrapped body, a source of fleeting entertainment, now just a pile of organic matter, is hard to shake. You realize that to get to the bottom of this mummy brown business, you can't stay in the drawing rooms of high society. You need to go to the source. Not the source in Egypt, not yet, but the source here in London. The place where the magic of art begins. You need to find a color man. You leave the Belgravia townhouse and make your way towards a less fashionable, more industrial part of the city. The streets here are narrower. The smell of coal is stronger, and the elegant clutter of carriages is replaced by the rumble of heavy laden carts. You're headed for a place you've heard artists talk about and revered, almost mystical tones, a supplier of artists' materials. These weren't just shops, they were workshops, laboratories, and artists' clubhouses rolled into one. You find the address on a busy, noisy street. The shopfront is unassuming, with large glass windows displaying pyramids of pigment in glass jars, bundles of brushes with pristine bristles, and rolls of primed canvas. The name Robertson Co. is painted in elegant gold letters above the door. Pushing it open, a small bell jingles, announcing your arrival. The air inside is an intoxicating cocktail of scents. You can smell the sharp tang of turpentine, the sweet, nutty aroma of linseed oil, the dusty scent of dry pigments, and the woody smell of freshly cut stretcher bars. It smells like creativity itself. The shop is a wonderland of artistic potential. The walls are lined with shelves that reach to the ceiling, crammed with jars of powdered color that form a glorious, chaotic rainbow. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, Cachinol from Mexico, Craze from the south of France. Each jar holds not just a color, but a place, a history, a journey. This is the mainstream understanding of a Victorian colorman shop. It was the hub of a global trade network, bringing the colors of the world to a painter's palette. Behind a long wooden counter, a man in a leather apron is meticulously grinding something on a thick slab of glass with a glass muller. He works the tool in a slow, circular motion, his entire focus on the small pile of dark powder he is transforming into a smooth paste. This is the color man himself. He's part chemist, part alchemist, part craftsman. Artists depended on him completely. They didn't just walk in and buy a pre-packaged above cadmium red. They would come to the color man, discuss the specific properties they needed: more transparency, a faster drying time, a grittier texture, and he would custom mix the pigment for them. His knowledge was a closely guarded secret, a mixture of ancient recipes and cutting-edge chemical discoveries. As you browse, you come across a strange and wonderful little fact about these places. Many of these colormen, like the famous George Field, kept chromatic diaries. They would paint swatches of their pigments into a book, recording the recipe, the source of the raw material, and notes on its behavior. But they often wrote their most valuable secrets in code, or used intentionally misleading language to protect their trade secrets from rivals. Reading one of these books today is like trying to decipher an alchemist's grimoire. It's a reminder that the science of color was still deeply intertwined with a world of secrecy and personal artistry. You approach the counter. The color man looks up, wiping his hands on his apron. His fingers are permanently stained with a kaleidoscope of colors. "Help you?" he asks, his voice gruff but not unkind. You feel a bit like an intruder in this sacred space. But you press on. You talk about art, about the Pre-Raphaelites, about the luminous shadows you saw in the gallery. You describe the specific brown you're looking for. Its unique transparency, its rich, deep tone. The colorman listens, nodding slowly. He seems to know exactly what you're talking about. He walks over to a row of wooden drawers behind him, the kind you might find in an old apothecary. He pulls one open. The debate among art historians here is fascinating. How much did these suppliers influence the artists to the color man? By promoting a new, exciting pigment he had in stock, actually shaped the palette of an entire artistic movement, or was it the other way around? With artists demanding new effects and forcing the suppliers to innovate and find new materials, it was almost certainly a symbiotic relationship. A painter like Turner, famous for his brilliant yellows, helped drive the market for new yellow pigments, while the availability of those new pigments, in turn, allowed him to push his art in new directions. The man returns to the counter and places a small, heavy object on the polished wood between you. It's not a jar of powder or a tube of paint. It's a lump, a dark, blackish brown, resinous lump. It looks like a piece of hardened tar, but there are other things embedded in it. You can see strands of what looks like fabric and other, unidentifiable fibrous materials. It's surprisingly heavy for its size. There's your raw material, the colorman says. The finest quality from a Ptolemaic era mummy. I believe the resin content is superb this season. He says it so casually, as if you were discussing the quality of the grape harvest. Your heart sinks. It wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't a joke. It's real. The raw material for the beautiful, glowing brown color that so captivated you in the gallery is, quite literally, a piece of a dead person. You stare at the lump on the counter. It's inert, ugly, and profoundly disturbing. Your mind struggles to connect this dark, grim object with the luminous, transcendent beauty you saw on the canvas. The killer man, misinterpreting your stunned silence as a sign of a discerning customer, picks up a small knife. See the quality, he says, scraping a bit off the edge. They fine. Dark brown powder falls onto the counter. It has a slight reddish undertone. It's the bitumen and the resins they used in the embalming. He explains, his voice filled with professional pride. That's what gives it that fantastic transparency. Modern pigments, they're all opaque, flat, no life to them. But this, he gestures to the lump, this has history in it. The artists, they love it. He walks over to a shelf and comes back with a small, bladder-tied package of prepared paint and a pre-filled tin tube, a relatively new invention that made paints portable. On the simple paper label of both is a printed inscription, stark and unambiguous Mummy Brown. There it is. The name isn't a euphemism or a poetic fancy. It is a statement of fact, a list of ingredients. This is a key historical point. The sale of Mummy Brown was not a secret, that galley trade. It was a mainstream, commercially available art supply, sold by reputable dealers like Rossetti & Co. and Winsor Newton right alongside Ultramarine and Vermilion. It was listed in their catalogues, available for anyone to buy. The car man continues his sales pitch. It grinds down beautifully, mixes with the oil like a dream, perfect for glazing, for shadows, for adding that certain gravitas. He uses the word gravitas without a trace of irony, while holding a piece of a human being. The sheer cognitive dissonance is staggering. You look around the shop again. Had the vibrant jars of cadmium yellow, a product of modern industrial chemistry, at the deep blue of ultramarine, once worth more than gold and painstakingly ground from lapis lazuli, and then at this brown, derived from the desecrated remains of an ancient civilization. It's a testament to the Victorian era's ability to hold to completely contradictory ideas in its head, at the same time a reverence for the past and a ruthless, unsentimental exploitation of it. You start to wonder about the logistics. This wasn't a one-off curiosity. The color man spoke of quality in this season's supply. This implies a steady stream, a trained route, a ghoulish supply chain that started in a tomb in Egypt and ended on a pallet in London. The color man offers you a strange, quirky tidbit, a piece of shop talk trivia. You have to be careful where you source it from. Of course, he says, lowering his voice, some of the cheaper stuff, the Roman-era mummies, they didn't use the good bitumen. The color is dull, no transparency, and you get all sorts of contaminants. But a good Ptolemaic or New Kingdom mummy, that's the gold standard. HES discussing human remains with the discerning palate of a wine connoisseur discussing vintages. There was a hierarchy, a grading system for the dead. But this raises a question that historians and archaeologists still ponder. Exactly how many mummies were destroyed for this trade, it's almost impossible to know. Records are sparse, and the trade was often informal. Were we talking about dozens of mummies, hundreds, thousands? The company C. Rossetti & Co. claimed in the 1960s that they had only just run out of mummies to make the pigment, suggesting a very long and perhaps not insignificant supply. Others argue that the number was likely smaller, and that much of what was sold as Mummy Brown might have been fraudulent, a mix of ordinary bitumen and other ingredients passed off as the real thing to fetch a higher price. The truth is, we will likely never know the true scale of this macabre industry. The evidence was, by its very nature, ground into dust. You look at the label again. Mummy Brown, So simple, so direct. The artists who bought this, did they know, could they possibly have seen that name and thought it was just a name, or did they know exactly what it wasn't, for the sake of their art? Decide not to care. The color man seems to assume you're an artist, ready to buy. He wraps the small bladder of paint in a piece of brown paper. A half ounce for you today, he asks. The banality of the transaction is the most shocking part. It's just another sale. Another pigment to be smeared on the canvas. You shake your head, unable to speak, then back out of the shop, the bell jingling your retreat. You need to understand the beginning of this story. Your journey can no longer stay in London. You have to go to the source. You have to go to Egypt. Your journey shifts. The damp, coal-scented fog of London dissolving into the brilliant, blinding sunlight of Alexandria. The transition is jarring. You're standing on the docks of a bustling, chaotic port city that feels like the crossroads of the world. The air is thick with the smells of salt, spices, fish, and coffee. You hear a dozen languages being spoken at once: Arabic, Greek, French, Italian, English. Donkey carts piled high with cotton bales jostle for space with smartly dressed European merchants and local dockworkers in long galley wires. The city is a vibrant, noisy, sun-baked tapestry of cultures, a world away from the muted craze and formal etiquette of London. You watch as a British steamship is being loaded. Cranes powered by steam and sweat winch enormous crates into its hold. Most of it is cotton, the white gold of Egypt that fuels the textile mills of Manchester. But you also see other cargo. Crates stenciled with the names of London antiquities dealers. Long, oblong boxes that are unmistakably sarcophagic. And then you see them rough, burlap-wrapped bundles, vaguely human shape, being carried up the gangplank with a shocking lack of ceremony. They're handled like any other piece of freight, stacked in a corner of the hold. There's no reverence here. This isn't history or archaeology. It's commerce. This is the starting point of the supply chain. The trade in mummies was a grim but well-established business in the 19th century. This is the central historical fact of this part of the story. While European museums and wealthy collectors were paying top dollar for intact, high-quality mummies with painted sarcophagi, there was a massive secondary market for the damaged, unwrapped, or lesser ones. These were the raw material. They were bought and sold by the pound, by the dozen, treated as a bulk commodity. The demand came from all corners for paper, for fertilizer and other short-lived but real use, for medicine, and, of course, for pigment. You follow the trail away from the port, into the labyrinthine alleys of the city, to the warehouses of the export merchants. Here, the scale of the operation becomes clearer. In a dusty, sun-drenched courtyard, you see piles of them, mummies, or parts of mummies, stacked like firewood. The sight is grotesque and surreal. It's hard to reconcile the sacred purpose for which these bodies were prepared with their current, profane fate. Workers, seemingly indifferent to the nature of their task, break down the bodies, sorting them. The resin-rich torsos are set aside, likely destined for the common men of Europe. The linen wrappings are bundled. Even the bones might be ground down for fertilizer or other uses. Nothing is wasted. You strike up a conversation with a local guide, a man who has seen it all. He tells you a fascinating, if morbid, piece of local lore. He says that the best mummies for the pigment trade, the ones richest in bitumen, often came from the necropolises of Sakava. But he adds, with a wry smile, that forgers were common. Unscrupulous dealers would sometimes take recently deceased animals, or even humans, wrap them in old linen, soak them in cheap, modern bitumen, and bake them in an oven to artificially age them, passing them off as genuine ancient mummies to unsuspecting European buyers. It was a ghoulish cottage industry built on deception. Authenticity was a selling point, even in the trade of human remains. This leads to a question that historians and bioarchaeologists are still trying to answer with modern scientific techniques. How much of the mummy material that made its way to Europe was actually ancient? When a modern museum conservator analyzes a swatch of mummy brown pigment, can they tell the difference between a 3,000-year-old pharaonic official and a 19th century donkey that was mummified in a back alley workshop in Cairo? It's an ongoing field of research, using techniques like carbon dating and gas chromatography on tiny specks of paint. They can try to identify the specific types of resins and tissues used, slowly piecing together the truth of this strange global trade. It's forensic science working on a century-old crime scene. Your guide offers to take you further, to see where the raw material really comes from. Not the warehouses, but the source itself. The tombs. He speaks of the Nile, of a journey south, into the heart of ancient Egypt, to the valleys where the dead have slept for millennia. It's a journey into the past, but also into the heart of a very current and very brutal industry. Geography. The port of Alexandria showed you the what. Now you need to understand the how and the why. You need to see the beginning of the journey. The moment a sacred tomb becomes a site of commercial extraction, as the sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting a golden glow over the bustling city, you prepare for a journey up the river, a journey into the darkness where the story of Mummy Brown truly begins. You leave the coastal clamor of Alexandria behind, your journey now taking you south, up the lifeblood of Egypt, the Nile. You're on a felucca, a traditional wooden sailing boat with a large, elegant lateen sail that catches the gentle northward breeze. The pace is slow, hypnotic. The landscape unfolds like a scroll. On either side of the river, a ribbon of vibrant green fields of sugar cane, dates, and wheat stretches for a few miles, teeming with life. And then, abruptly, it stops. Beyond that green ribbon lies the vast, empty, ochre-colored expanse of the desert. A silent, sun-scorched world that seems to go on forever. It's in this stark boundary between life and death that the ancient Egyptians built their cities for the dead. Your destination is a place whispered about by your guide to the Ben necropolis, across the river from modern-day Luxor. This is the location of the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, the final resting place of pharaohs, queens, and nobles from the New Kingdom, the golden age of ancient Egypt. This is the main historical setting for the great tomb discoveries. For over 1,000 years, this was one of the most sacred and heavily guarded places on Earth. But the 19th century version you're arriving at is a very different place. It's a chaotic, dusty, and lawless frontier. It's a battleground for competing interests. You have the official, government-sanctioned excators, often European consuls like the notoriously competitive Bernardino di Rovetti of France and Henry Salt of Britain. They command small armies of local workers, frantically digging for treasures to fill the museums of Paris and London. They are, in their own way, plundering the tombs, but they do so under the guise of national prestige and scientific inquiry. Then you have the local Egyptian families, who have lived on top of this necropolis for generations. To them, the tombs beneath their houses are not just historical sites, they are their ancestral inheritance, a little treasure trove to be mined. A family might own the rights to a certain section of the hillside, and they work the tombs as a family business. They know the terrain, they know the secrets, and they are masters at finding undiscovered chambers. And finally, you have the freelance tomb robbers, the opportunistic bandits who work under the cover of darkness, seeking a quick score. The lines between these three groups are incredibly blurry. A man might be a foreman for a European archaeologist by day and a freelance robber for his family by night. It's a complex, shifting ecosystem of discovery and destruction. You follow your guide up a rocky, sun-blasted road. The heat is oppressive. The silence is profound. All you can hear is the crunch of your own footsteps on the gravel and the buzzing of flies. The hillsides around you are pockmarked with dark openings, the entrances to countless tombs. Some are grand, with carved facades. Others are little more than rough holes in the rock. It looks like a giant, ancient honeycomb, and it's being systematically torn apart. Your guide leads you to a less conspicuous opening, hidden behind a rockfall. He lights a sputtering oil lamp. "Be careful," he whispers, and you descend into the cool, still darkness. The air changes instantly. It's dry, musty, and filled with the scent of millennia-old dust. As your eyes adjust, the lamplight reveals walls covered in stunning, brightly colored paintings, gods with the heads of jackals and falcons, scenes of farming and feasting, and rows of intricate hieroglyphs telling the life story of the tomb's owner. It's breathtaking. You're standing in a time capsule. But the capsule has been broken. The floor is littered with broken pottery, fragments of wooden furniture, and scraps of linen wrappings. The sarcophagus in the center of the chamber has been smashed open. Its lid cast aside. The mummy that was once inside is gone. This is the scene that confronted so many early excavators. This is not the work of your 19th century crew. This is ancient tomb robbery. Here's a little-known fact: the vast majority of Egyptian tombs, including those in the Valley of the Kings, were robbed in antiquity, often within a few generations of their sealing. The workers who built the tombs knew where they were and what was inside. Economic hardship, political instability, these were all triggers for waves of tomb raiding throughout Egyptian history. It was a persistent problem for the pharaohs, and it's a major headache for modern archaeologists. But what the ancient robbers were after was gold, jewelry, and precious oils. They would often unwrap the mummy to get at the amulet stuck within the bandages, and then leave the body itself behind. The 19th century plunderers, however, were different. They would take everything: the furniture, the statues, the sarcophagus, and yes, the body itself. The mummy had become a commodity. The question that historians still debate is the extent of the damage done in this period versus in antiquity. When an archaeologist finds a plundered tomb, it can be incredibly difficult to tell if the mess is 3,000 years old or 150 years old. Was this tomb ransacked by ancient thieves looking for gold? Or was it cleared out last year by a local crew looking for anything they could sell to a European dealer? Including the mummy itself, it's a complex archaeological puzzle, a crime scene with multiple suspects separated by millennia. As you stand in the desecrated silence of the tomb, the flickering lamplight casting dancing shadows on the painted walls, you understand. This is the true beginning. It starts here, in the sacred darkness, with a crowbar and a flickering lamp. It starts with the transformation of a revered ancestor into a piece of merchandise. The journey from this quiet, hallowed space to the noisy, industrial workshop of the London colourman is a long and brutal one. And you have just witnessed its first, violent step. You emerge from the tomb, blinking in the harsh sunlight, the bright paintings of the underworld still seared into your vision. Your guide, seeing the disturbed look on your face, gives a small, knowing shrug. To him, this is just a fact of life. He leads you over to a makeshift camp, a small cluster of tents set up by one of the European-led excavation teams. Pierre, the process becomes more organized, more scientific, but no less unsettling. Workers are carrying baskets of artifacts out of a newly opened tomb. You see painted pottery, Oshab toy figurines, and fragments of a gilded chariot. The European archaeologist in charge, a man with a sunburnt face and an air of intense concentration, is meticulously recording each item in a notebook. It all looks very professional. But then, a team of workers emerges from the tomb carrying a mummy on a simple wooden stretcher. It's relatively intact, still wrapped in its layers of linen, though the outer wrappings are dark and stained. The archaeologist gives it a cursory glance. He's looking for inscriptions, for clues to the identity of the deceased. But he seems disappointed. No sarcophagus, he mutters to his assistant, probably a minor official. Nothing of museum quality. He gestures dismissively. Take it to the pile. You watch as the workers carry the ancient official over to a designated area and add him to a small but growing collection of other mummies, all deemed not important enough for a museum's main collection. They are archaeological byproducts. This is where the strange and ghoulish grading system you heard about in the London paint shop truly begins. The mainstream historical narrative of archaeology focuses on the discovery of treasures like Tutankhamun's mummy. But the reality was that for every spectacular, intact royal burial found, excavators uncovered dozens, if not hundreds, of less remarkable tombs containing the mummies of ordinary people, priests, scribes, artisans, and officials. These were the middle class of ancient Egypt, and their preserved bodies became the working class of the 19th century mummy trade. Your guide explains the informal hierarchy. At the very top, grade A, you have a royal mummy in a nested set of gilded coffins and a stone sarcophagus. This is priceless, a treasure for a national museum. Grade B might be a high official in a single, beautifully painted coffin, still very valuable, destined for a private collection or a smaller museum. Grade C is an intact mummy but with a plain coffin or no coffin at all. These might be sold to universities for study or, as you saw, used for unwrapping parties. And then there's grade D, the damaged, the broken, the anonymous, the ones found in plundered tombs, or the ones that fall apart during excavation. These have little to no academic or artistic value as display pieces. They are, essentially, scrap. And it is this scrap that fuels the industrial users, the pigment, the paper, the fertilizer. Here's a bizarre and little-known detail that highlights this commodification. Dealers and excavators would sometimes create more valuable mummies by mixing and matching parts. They might take a well-preserved mummy from a plain coffin and place it inside a more ornate, unrelated coffin they found elsewhere, hoping to sell the combination for a higher price. It was like creating a fantasy piece of furniture. Sometimes, they even put the wrong lid on a coffin if it had a more interesting face. For archaeologists today, this practice is a nightmare. It's why they sometimes find a coffin inscribed for a man containing the mummy of a woman, or a New Kingdom mummy inside a Ptolemaic era coffin. It muddles the historical record, all for the sake of 19th century market value. This practice leads to a debate that still simmers among Egyptologists. Can we trust the provenance of any unscientifically excavated mummy when a museum has a mummy in its collection that was acquired in the 19th century? How much of its identity, its coffin, its wrappings, its supposed name is original? And how much is a dealer's fabrication? It requires a huge amount of scientific detective work to untangle these old deceptions, and some cases may never be solved. You watch as a local trader arrives at the camp. He has a quiet word with the archaeologist's foreman. Money changes hands. A short time later, the trader and his own workers load the grade D mummies, including the minor official you just saw, onto the backs of camels. Their journey to the warehouses of Alexandria has begun. You realize the chilling efficiency of it all. A body that has rested in sacred darkness for 3,000 years can be excavated, graded, declared commercially viable, and sold as raw material within a matter of hours. The archaeologist may not be directly selling the bodies to the collar man, but by creating this category of unimportant dead, he is feeding the very top of the supply chain that does. He keeps the treasures and allows the rest to be carted away, washing his hands of their ultimate fate. The line between science and commerce is not just blurry here, it's practically non-existent. The scene shifts again. You followed the grim cargo from the sun-scorched valley in Egypt, across the Mediterranean, and back into the familiar, grimy heart of industrial London. You are no longer in a pristine gallery or a fashionable drawing room. You are in a workshop in a district like Southwark, on the south bank of the Thames. The air here is thick with the acrid smoke from factories and the foul smell from tanneries and breweries. This is the underbelly of the Victorian metropolis, the place where raw materials are transformed into finished goods. You're standing in a dusty, poorly lit workshop that belongs, not to a colour man, but to a pharmaceutical supplier or a general importer. This is often the first stop for the mummies upon their arrival in England. In a corner of the workshop, you see them a dozen or so of the burlap wrap bundles you last saw being loaded onto a ship in Alexandria. They look modern and anonymous here, stripped of all their historical context. Just sacks of grim potential waiting to be processed. A man in a heavy leather apron, his face smudged with dark dust. Approaches one of the bundles. He unwraps the outer burlap, revealing the dark, resin-caked mummy within. There is no ceremony here, no scientific curiosity. This is not an unwrapping party. This is a disassembly line. With a heavy mallet and a chisel, the worker begins the brutal process of breaking the body down. The crack of ancient, brittle bone echoes in the dusty room. It is a sickening, percussive sound. The goal is to separate the body into its constituent parts. The linen wrappings, stiff with bitumen and resin, are torn off. The bones are tossed into one pile. The flesh and resin-caked tissues into another. This is the central, grim reality of how Mummy Brown was made. It wasn't ground from an intact, full mummy. The raw material was specifically the flesh of the mummy, which, through the embalming process, had become saturated with bitumen, resins, and other aromatic substances. It was this unique organic, inorganic composite material that gave the pigment its coveted properties. The bones and linens were often sold off for other purposes. The real value for the color man was in the desiccated, resin-soaked flesh. You witness a part of the process that is rarely discussed, a strange and unsettling bit of workshop trivia. The workers in these facilities develop a macabre form of expertise. They can supposedly tell the quality of the material just by the smell and the way it breaks apart. A mummy that is too dry and dusty is no good, it lacks the resinous binder. One that is too gummy is also a problem, as it will be difficult to grind. They search for a perfect balance. A body that has been well embalmed with the right kinds of substances, creating a final product that is hard, brittle, and rich in color. The workers, covered in the dust of the dead, are the first and most hands-on critics of the ancient Egyptian embalmer's craft. The sorted material, the dark, hard chunks of flesh and resin, is then put into a large, heavy-duty grinding mill. It could be a hand-cranked stone mill, similar to one used for grinding grain, or a more industrial, steam-powered crusher. The machine groans to life, and the chunks of what was once a person are pulverized into a coarse, dark brown powder. This is the raw pigment. This is the stuff that the color man you met earlier would buy in bulk. He would then perform the final, more delicate stage of grinding himself, mixing the powder with linseed oil on his glass slab to create the smooth, rich paint the artist desired. The question of who was doing this work is one that historians find intriguing. Was it the large, reputable color men like Winsor Newton processing the mummies in their own factories, or were they buying the pre-ground powder from these shadowy third-party importers and processors? The historical record is hazy. It's likely that both happened. Some larger firms may have handled the entire process from import to final paint too, while smaller color men probably bought the ready-made powder from these specialized grinders. It was a distributed network of desecration, allowing for a degree of plausible deniability at each step. The artist buys from the color man, who buys from the grinder, who buys from the importer, who buys from the trader in Egypt. Each link in the chain is slightly removed from the horror of the source. As you stand in the corner of this grim workshop, watching the dust of a human being settle on every surface, you realize the profound transformation that has occurred. In Egypt, this was a sacred body, prepared with ritual and care for an eternal afterlife. At the unwrapping party, it was a scientific curiosity, an object of entertainment. Here, in this workshop, it has reached its final, undignified state, an industrial commodity. It has been rendered down to its most basic, usable form. Its humanity has been utterly and completely erased, ground into an anonymous, marketable powder, ready to be mixed with oil and given a new, and final, life on the tip of a painter's brush. You leave the industrial noise and grime of the processing workshop behind, the fine, dark dust seeming to follow you, clinging to your clothes and your conscience. You need to see the final step of the journey, the moment of redemption, or perhaps the ultimate act of unknowing appropriation. You find yourself back in the world of art, but this time, you are not in a public gallery. You are in the private studio of a successful Pre-Raphaelite painter. The studio is on the top floor of a house in a leafy, affluent neighborhood like Chelsea. It's a magnificent room, with a huge, north-facing window that floods the space with a cool, even light. The air smells of oil paint, turpentine, and dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Canvases in various states of completion are everywhere. Some are on easels. Others are stacked against the walls. There are props scattered about: a suit of gleaming armor, a velvet draped over a chair, a lute with a broken string, a human skull sitting on a bookshelf next to a volume of Keats. It is an organized chaos of creation. The artist himself is there, a man with an intense gaze and a paint-smeared smock. He is completely absorbed in his work, dabbing at a large canvas with a fine-tipped brush. On the canvas is the face of a woman with a sorrowful expression, her skin rendered in soft, glowing tones. The artist is working on the shadows that define her cheekbones and the hollow of her neck. This is where Mummy Brown was most prized. This is its mainstream artistic application, because of its transparency and its organic, fleshy undertones. It was considered by many to be the perfect pigment for painting skin. It could be applied in thin layers or glazes to create shadows that weren't just black or grey, that were deep and alive. It gave flesh a luminous quality that was difficult to achieve with other earth pigments. The artist steps back from the canvas to study his work, his head cocked to one side. He then turns to his palette, a large wooden board covered in daubs of color. You see the vibrant reds, the brilliant blues, the earthy ochre. And there, near his thumb, is a smear of rich, translucent brown. He picks up his palette knife, takes a small amount of the brown paste from a tin tube, and mixes it with a little linseed oil and a touch of lead white to make it slightly more opaque. He is a master of his materials, knowing exactly how to modulate the pigment to get the precise effect he desires. He then does something that seems completely normal to him, but is utterly bizarre to you. He dips his brush into the mummy brown mixture and then, almost unconsciously, licks the tip of the brush to bring it to a fine point before applying a delicate shadow to the corner of the woman's eye. This is a fascinating and horrifying little detail that many art historians believe was a common practice. Artists, seeking the finest possible point for detail work, would often use their mouths to shape their brushes. It's a habit that led to many cases of painter's colic, or lead poisoning, from pigments like lead white. But the idea of an artist licking a brush laden with a pigment made from a 3-0-year-old person is a new level of macabre intimacy. He is, in the most literal sense possible, tasting history. But did he know this is the great, unresolved debate that hangs over the entire story of Mummy Brown? Did the artists who used it know its true origin? The name itself seems like a dead giveaway. It's hard to imagine someone seeing a tube labeled Mummy Brown and thinking it was named for its color, like chocolate brown. However, the arguments for their ignorance, or at least their willful ignorance, are compelling. The art world was filled with fanciful names. Perhaps they assumed it was a type of bitumen from a region where mummies were found, or a historical name for a pigment that was no longer made from the real thing. It's possible that the color men, wanting to sell their product, were deliberately vague about the production process. They might have praised its organic properties without specifying the exact nature of the organism. Some historians argue that most artists were simply incurious. They were practical craftspeople. If a pigment worked, they used it. They were concerned with transparency, drying time, and permanence, not with the ethics of its supply chain. They lived in an era where the world's resources, both natural and cultural, were being plundered to fuel European industry and art. A pigment made from an ancient Egyptian might not have seemed as shocking to them as it does to us. It may have simply been one more exotic import from the far-flung corners of the British Empire. The truth is, we can't get inside their heads. The level of knowledge likely varied from artist to artist. Some probably knew and didn't care. Some may have had their suspicions but chose not to ask. And some, perhaps many, may have been genuinely oblivious, thinking that Mummy Brown was just another evocative, poetic name on their palette. You watch as the artist applies the final touch of shadow. The face on the canvas seems to breathe. The sorrow in her eyes feels real. Her skin looks soft and warm. He has used the remains of one long-dead person to bring the image of another to life. It is a moment of profound and unsettling alchemy. The ugly, dark lump you saw on the colorman's counter has been transfigured, through the artist's skill, into a thing of sublime beauty. The final destination has been reached. The journey is complete. But the story is far from over. As you observe the painter in his sanctuary, lost in the act of creation, a crucial question hangs in the air, thick as the scent of turpentine. Did he and his colleagues truly know what they were painting with? This isn't just a matter of idle curiosity, it's a debate that cuts to the heart of the Pre-Raphaelite image and the broader Victorian psyche. Were these sensitive, poetic souls, who painted scenes of legendary romance and tragic beauty, knowingly complicit in a ghoulish trade, or were they blissfully, perhaps willfully, ignorant? The case for ignorance is plausible, built on the idea of a domed house. Their toll policy that permeated the relationship between artist and color man. The artist's primary concern was the result on the canvas. They were searching for specific technical properties of brown that was transparent, that could be glazed, that wouldn't crack, and that had a unique, warm undertone. The color man, a shrewd businessman, would provide a product that met these needs. He might say, "This is the famous Mummy Brown, the secret to the old master's fresh tones," playing on a historical mystique rather than its literal composition. The name itself, while shocking to us, might have been normalized over time, becoming just another term in the artistic lexicon, its original meaning worn away by casual use. Imagine the conversation. The artist complains that his umbers are too muddy. The color man says, "Then you must try the Mummy Brown. Nothing like it for achieving that luminous depth." He might conveniently omit the part about the grinding mills and Southwark. The artist, thrilled with the result, asks no further questions. It's a form of plausible deniability. The artist gets his perfect pigment, the color man makes his sale, and no one has to confront the uncomfortable reality. However, the case for their knowledge, or at least a strong suspicion, is equally compelling. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and their associates were not uneducated laborers. They were intelligent, well-read, and deeply engaged with the culture of their time. And as you've seen, Egyptomania was rampant. Mummy unwrapping parties were a known, if bizarre, form of social entertainment. Articles about Egyptian discoveries and the trade in antiquities were common in popular magazines and newspapers like the Illustrated London News. The very idea that mummies were being imported and used for various industrial purposes was not a state secret. It floated in the ether of Victorian society, for a group of men so obsessed with truth to nature and authenticity. It seems almost inconceivable that they would not be curious about the truth of their own materials. This leads us to the central, contentious historical debate: was Mummy Brown an open secret in the art world? Historians are divided. Some argue that it was common knowledge, a kind of dark joke among artists. They might have complained about the quality, with one painter wryly remarking that his tube of Mummy Brown was a bit stringy this time. A direct, if grim, reference to its origin. In this view, using the pigment was a mark of a certain kind of unsentimental professionalism. Art was hard, messy work, and you used the materials that got the job done, no matter how unsettling their source. Other historians argue that knowledge was compartmentalized. Perhaps the older, more established artists knew, but the younger students at the Royal Academy did not. Or perhaps it was known to the oil painters, but not to the water cultivators who used a different preparation of the pigment. Maybe it was a secret that was only passed down from a master to a trusted apprentice. There is no definitive account. No smoking gun letter from Rossetti to Malays saying, "I just bought a marvelous new batch of ground-up priest from Thebes." The evidence is circumstantial, anecdotal, and tantalizingly incomplete. Artists often complained that mummy brown was a fugitive pigment, meaning it was not light-fast and could fade or change color over time. They also noted its poor drying qualities and its tendency to crack. One 19th century manual on pigments warns that the artist's color is probably not one to be recommended for permanency. This is deliciously ironic. A pigment made from a substance that was designed to last for eternity was, itself, fleeting and unstable on the canvas. Did the artists who knew its origin appreciate this irony, or did the pigment's practical flaws contribute to a sense of it being a strange, exotic, and slightly taboo material, one to be used sparingly and with caution? So, you are left in the artist's studio, watching him work, and you must become the historian, weighing the evidence. Look at his face, concentrated and serene. Does it show the calm focus of an artist unaware of the dark secret in his tools, or is it the practiced indifference of a professional who has made a pragmatic, if morally questionable, bargain with his supplier for the sake of his art? The truth is, you can't be sure, and that uncertainty is, in itself, a powerful part of the story. The silence in the studio is not just the silence of concentration. It's the silence of history, a space filled with unanswered questions and the quiet complicity of an entire era. Your journey into the world of Mummy Brown has so far been focused on art, the gallery, the studio, the colorman's shop. But as you stand in the quiet of the artist's workspace, you realize that the use of mummies in Europe has a much longer and even stranger history. The 19th century painters were not the first to discover the macabre potential of preserved Egyptian bodies. They were simply the inheritors of a centuries-old tradition. To understand the context for Mummy Brown, you have to rewind the clock, long before the Pre-Raphaelites, before Napoleon, to a time when mummies weren't used for painting, but for medicine. The scene dissolves from the artist's studio to a bustling, chaotic apothecary shop in Renaissance Europe, perhaps in Venice or Genoa in the 16th century. The air here is thick with the scent of dried herbs, spices, and strange chemical concoctions. Jars containing bizarre ingredients line the shelves, dried newts, powdered gemstones, and, in a prominent position, dark, blackish lumps and powders labeled mummia. This is the key historical fact that predates our entire story for hundreds of years. From the Middle Ages well into the 18th century, powdered mummy was a common and highly prized medicinal ingredient in Europe. It was prescribed by physicians and sold by apothecaries as a panacea, a cure-all for a staggering range of ailments. It was used to treat everything from headaches and coughs to bruises, epilepsy, and poisoning. You could buy it as a powder to be mixed with wine, or as a pre-mixed tincture or salve. It was the ultimate wonder drug of its time. But how on earth did this practice start? The origin lies in a colossal misunderstanding. The story begins with a natural substance called bitumen or asphalt, which seeps from the ground in certain parts of the Middle East, particularly in Persia. The Persian word for this substance was mumaya. For centuries, this natural bitumen was used as a traditional medicine, believed to have healing anti-inflammatory properties. When early Arab travelers and physicians encountered the embalmed bodies in Egypt, they noticed that the corpses were oft uncoated in a similar-looking dark, resinous substance to preserve them. They mistakenly assumed that the preservation was achieved using this medicinal Persian bitumen. Therefore, they reasoned, the bodies themselves must have absorbed the healing properties of the mumaya. So when they referred to the preserved bodies, they called them mummies, and the substance scraped from them was also called mummia. Over time, the original meaning was lost. European physicians, reading translations of Arabic medical texts, came to believe that the key ingredient was not the natural mineral bitumen, but the embalmed human flesh itself. The demand for medicinal mummia exploded. It became one of the most ghoulish and extensive trades between Egypt and Europe for centuries. Tombs were plundered not for art, but for medicine. Entire bodies, as well as fragments, were shipped to European ports to be ground down by apothecaries. Here's a bizarre and fascinating tidbit from this older period because the demand for genuine ancient Egyptian mummies often outstripped the supply. A gruesome counterfeit industry emerged. Just as you heard about in 19th century Alexandria, forgers in the 16th and 17th centuries would create fake mummies to sell to the apothecaries. They would take the bodies of recently executed criminals, destitute peasants, or victims of the plague, embalm them using a crude mixture of bitumen and spices, and dry them in the sun or in oven. These modern mummies were then passed off as ancient artifacts from the tombs of the pharaohs. The French surgeon Ambroise Paré, writing in the 16th century, railed against this fraudulent trade, describing in detail how these counterfeit mummies were made and arguing that consuming them was not only useless but dangerous. This long history raises a fascinating question that medical historians and chemists still explore. Did medicinal mummy have any actual therapeutic effect? The answer is almost certainly no. At least not in the way it was intended. Consuming powdered human remains and bitumen is not a cure for epilepsy. However, some researchers have speculated that the bitumen used in some mummification processes might have had certain antibacterial properties, which could have made it slightly effective as a topical salve for wounds. But its widespread use as an ingested cure-all was pure placebo, driven by superstition and the mistaken belief that one could consume the longevity and strength of the ancient Egyptians. It was, in essence, a form of ritualistic cannibalism disguised as medicine. Thinking about this long, dark history, the Victorian use of mummies for paint seems slightly less shocking, if no less strange. It wasn't a sudden, bizarre invention. It was simply a new application for a material that had been an object of trade and consumption for over 500 years. By the 19th century, the medical belief in mumia had largely faded with the rise of modern science. The mummy was no longer a medicine, but the trade routes were established. The supply chain existed, and the material was still available. The color men, ever the innovators, simply found a new market for the old product. They repurposed the wonder drug of the Renaissance as the wonder pigment of the industrial age. The artist licking his brush in the 19th century was unknowingly echoing the 16th century patient drinking his prescription of powdered mummy in a cup of wine. The method of consumption had changed, but the core ingredient remained the same. Your mind is now armed with a dizzying amount of context. You've seen the London Gallery, the Egyptian tomb, the grinder's workshop, the artist's studio, and even the Renaissance apothecary. Now, it's time to bring all of that knowledge back to where you started: a single, finished painting hanging on a wall. But this time, you won't just see it. You will read it in a completely new way. You find yourself standing in front of a famous painting. Let's say The Golden Stairs by Edward Burne-Jones. It's a huge, vertical canvas depicting a procession of beautiful, androgynous women in classical robes, descending a winding staircase. They all have the same dreamy, melancholic expression. They carry musical instruments, but no one is playing. The mood is one of quiet, mysterious ceremony. It's a masterpiece of the aesthetic movement, a later phase of the Pre-Raphaelite ethos, where the goal was not to tell a story, but to create a mood and celebrate art for art's sake. First, you look at the painting with the eyes of a conventional lover. You admire the composition, the flowing lines of the women's gowns, the delicate modeling of their faces and hands, the harmonious color palette of creams, golds, and silvery grays. It is, by any measure, an object of sublime beauty. It's designed to be calming, to transport you to a world of pure, ethereal grace. Now, you look again, but this time, you activate your new knowledge. You focus on the shadows, the deep, warm shadows in the folds of the women's robes, the soft, brownish haze in the background that gives the scene its sense of depth and atmosphere, the dark, rich tones of the wooden instruments they carry. You know, with a chilling certainty, that many of these shadows are painted with mummy brown. Suddenly, the painting is no longer a serene, self-contained world. It is a haunted object, the procession of silent women now seems like a ghostly parade. You start to imagine the invisible presence of another group of people within the canvas, the ancient Egyptians, whose physical bodies were ground into the very substance of the paint. A minor priest from Thebes, a courtier from Amarna, a woman from the Ptolemaic period. Their atoms are literally mixed into the oil and smeared onto the canvas. The painting becomes a kind of composite entity, a collaboration across millennia between a Victorian artist and his unwilling Egyptian material donors. This is the central, unsettling power of this secret knowledge. It fundamentally changes your relationship with the artwork. The art for art's sake ideal of Burne-Jones is shattered. The painting is no longer just about beauty, it is about history, ethics, colonialism, and death. The gravitas the colorman spoke of is no longer a poetic metaphor, it is a literal truth. The painting has a physical weight, a material density, that is directly tied to human remains. You lean closer and examine a specific detail, the hair of one of the women. It's a beautiful, rich auburn, painted with delicate, feathery strokes. The artist has used a glaze of mummy brown over a lighter underpainting to give it depth and translucent. You can't help but think of the irony. The hair of this idealized English beauty is painted with the flesh of a real, long-dead Egyptian. There's a strange, cannibalistic quality to it, a theme that runs beneath the surface of this entire story, from the medicinal mummy to the artist's brush. Here's a small, poignant fact to consider. Many of the mummies that were plundered and ground up were anonymous. Their names, their stories, their identities were lost. The intricate spells of the Book of the Dead, intended to preserve their name for eternity, had failed, but in a strange, ghostly way, they achieved a different kind of immortality. They became part of a new sacred object, a work of art. Their physical substance lives on, protected in the climate-controlled environment of a museum, admired by millions. Is this a desecration, or a bizarre form of resurrection? Art conservators and historians still grapple with this question. When they analyze a painting and confirm the presence of mummy brown, how should that information be presented to the public? Should it be a footnote in a technical report, or a central part of the painting's interpretation? Does knowing the grim origin of the paint diminish the artist's achievement, or does it add a new, profound layer of meaning to the work? There is no consensus. Some argue that the artist's intent is what matters, and that the material source is irrelevant to the aesthetic experience. Others contend that to ignore the origin is to whitewash a dark chapter of history and to continue the objectification of the Egyptian dead. As you gaze at the golden stairs, you are caught between these two ways of seeing. You can still appreciate the formal beauty, the skill, the ethereal mood, but you can no longer unknow what you know. The silent women on the stairs are no longer alone. You can almost feel the presence of the other souls trapped in the paint, their silent history absorbed into the canvas. The golden stairs don't just lead down into the world of the painting, they led down into the tombs of Egypt, into the dark workshops of London, and into the deepest, most unsettling corners of the Victorian imagination. You pull your gaze away from the haunted beauty of the Burne-Jones painting, your mind buzzing with the ethical implications. But then a more practical, almost mundane question surfaces. Was mummy brown actually any good beyond its ghoulish origin and its unique transparency? What was it like to actually use? You decide to shift your focus from the art patrons and historians to the artists themselves, not as philosophical beings, but as practical craftspeople. What did they write about it in their letters, their diaries, their technical manuals? You find yourself in an imaginary archive, a library of artists' personal accounts. The picture that emerges is surprisingly mixed. Mummy brown, it turns out, was a notoriously inconsistent and often frustrating pigment. For every artist who praised its transparency, there was another who cursed its unpredictability. This is the mainstream technical assessment of the pigment. It was a gamble every time you squeezed it from the tube. One of the biggest complaints was its texture. You remember the colorman boasting about a mummy being a bit of a bugger to grind. He wasn't kidding. The process of pulverizing desiccated flesh, bone fragments, and resin rarely resulted in a perfectly fine, uniform powder. As a result, many artists found the paint to be gritty. An artist trying to paint a smooth, flawless glaze on a porcelain matte cheek might find his brush stroke marred by a tiny, yet unfightable speck. Imagine the frustration you're working on a masterpiece, and your paint, quite literally, has lumps in it. Some artists' manuals from the period give advice on how to further grind or refine the pigment in the studio, a time-consuming extra step that you wouldn't need with a reliable earth pigment like raw umber. Then there was the problem of permanence, or the lack thereof. You've already heard whispers about it being a fugitive pigment. Many contemporary accounts confirm this. It was known to be unreliable in sunlight, prone to fading over time. Worse, it often behaved poorly when mixed with other colors. It could react chemically with certain other pigments, particularly lead-based whites, causing discoloration or cracking years after the painting was completed. The very substance that made it unique, the complex, organic mixture of fats, resins, and bitumen, also made it unstable. It was, in chemical terms, a mess. Here's a wonderfully specific and quirky anecdote that illustrates this perfectly. The French painter Eugène Delacroix, a titan of the Romantic movement and domestic colorist, was a known user of mummy brown. However, his supplier in Paris once sent him to mummies the preserved bodies of two 16th century Egyptian kings to be ground for his personal use. Delacroix, despite his love for the pigment's effect, was apparently so horrified by the idea of grinding up these specific, named individuals that he couldn't go through with it. He kept the two kings in his studio for years, unable to use them but also unwilling to part with them. The story highlights the strange line artists sometimes drew anonymous. Powdered mummy from a tube was one thing, personally ordering the destruction of two historical figures was another. This story, however, brings up a point of contention among art historians. The tale of Delacroix and his two kings is widely repeated, but its original source is somewhat murky and possibly apocryphal. Did it really happen, or is it a later invention? A dramatic story created to illustrate the moral quandaries of the pigment. Some historians have tried to trace the provenance of the story in the mummies themselves without definitive success. It's a classic case of a historical anecdote that is so good, so perfectly illustrative, that it has resisted rigorous fact-checking. It exists in a state of being true enough, a powerful piece of lore in the history of pigments. So why, if it was so problematic, did artists continue to use it? The answer lies in its one undeniable virtue that's unique: glowing transparency for certain applications, particularly the glazing of shadows and flesh tones. There was simply nothing else like it. An artist might struggle with its grittiness and worry about its permanence, but when they successfully applied that final, perfect glaze and saw the way it made the skin seem to glow from within, all was forgiven. It was a Faustian bargain on the palette. They traded reliability and permanence for a fleeting moment of unparalleled aesthetic effect. This explains why you might see it used in one part of a painting but not another. An artist might use stable, reliable earth tones for the broad areas of a landscape or background, but then switch to the risky, beautiful mummy brown for the most important part of the painting, the face of the Madonna, the flesh of a hero, the very parts of the canvas meant to convey life and emotion. It was a special effects pigment, reserved for the starring role. The frustration and the gamble were, for a select group of painters, worth the price of admission. You pull back from the technical details of the paint and the artist's frustrations. You understand the what and the how. Now you need to grapple with the why. Why was this practice, which seems so self-evidently horrifying to us, acceptable to a society that considered itself the pinnacle of civilization? To understand this, you have to wade into the murky waters of the Victorian mindset, a complex soup of science, religion, progress, and prejudice. You find yourself in a new setting, a lecture hall at a prestigious British university, sometime in the 1872. A distinguished professor with a long grey beard is standing at a lecture, delivering a lecture on anthropology. Behind him are charts displaying different human skulls, arranged in a hierarchy from primitive to advanced. At the top, naturally, is the scholar European. Further down are the scores of Asians, Africans, and indigenous peoples. This is the mainstream, and now thoroughly debunked, science of phrenology and racial typology that was dominant in the Victorian era. It was a pseudoscience that provided a convenient justification for colonialism. It argued that certain races were inherently less developed, childlike, and incapable of governing themselves or properly stewarding their own history. This mindset is the key to understanding why using a mummy for paint wasn't seen as a profound moral transgression. The ancient Egyptians, while admired for their monuments and their mystique, were still viewed through this colonial lens. They were a dead civilization. Their modern descendants were seen as impoverished and backward. The British, as the new imperial power in the region, saw themselves as the rightful inheritors and custodians of this ancient legacy. In their view, they were not desecrating bodies, they were utilizing a resource that the locals were neglecting. It was a mindset that transformed to mobbing into archaeology and the destruction of human remains into industrial progress. This sense of superiority was woven into the fabric of society. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in the magnificent Crystal Palace, was a grand celebration of this idea. It showcased the industrial might and cultural products of Britain and its empire. Raw materials and artifacts flowed in from every corner of the globe: Indian silks, and yes, Egyptian antiquities. The world was a storehouse of resources for Britain to use, process, and sell back to the world as finished goods. A mummy, in this context, was just another raw material, no different in principle from a block of marble from Italy or a log of mahogany from the Caribbean. Its humanity was secondary to its utility. But here's a fascinating and contradictory little fact about the Victorians. While they could be ruthlessly unsentimental about the bodies of foreign peoples, they were also developing a new, highly sentimental and deliberate culture around their own dead. This was the era of grand, park-like cemeteries, ornate mourning rituals, post-mortem photography where families would pose with their recently deceased loved ones, and a deep public fascination with grief. Queen Victoria's decades-long mourning for Prince Albert set the tone for the entire nation. They took their own dead very, very seriously. This creates a stark and telling paradox. How could a society that wore black for years to mourn a husband and wrote sentimental poetry about the death of a child simultaneously condone grinding up another culture's dead for paint? This is a question historians still actively debate. Was it pure hypocrisy, or did they genuinely not see the contradiction? The answer probably lies in the concept of the other. The rules, sentiments, and religious sanctities that applied to a Christian English person in London simply did not apply to a pagan Egyptian in a 3,000-year-old tomb, the circle of who was considered fully human, with all the rights and respects that entails, was drawn very tightly. The Egyptian mummy was outside that circle. It was a thing, an artifact, a curiosity, a pigment. It was not a person in the same way that Uncle Albert, buried in Highgate Cemetery, was. This cognitive dissonance, this ability to hold to completely opposing views at once, is perhaps the defining feature of the Victorian era. It was a time of profound Christian faith and burgeoning scientific materialism. It was an age of strict public morality and rampant hidden vice. It was an era of immense charity and brutal industrial exploitation. And it was an age that could sentimentalize its own dead while commodifying the dead of others. The story of Mummy Brown is not an anomaly, it is a perfect symptom of this deeply conflicted worldview. It is the product of a society that was so confident in its own progress that it couldn't see its own blind spots. A society that could create breathtaking works of art while being utterly blind to the darkness of its materials. For decades, the use of Mummy Brown existed in the strained, grey zone of open secrets and willful ignorance. Artists used it, colour men sold it, and the public, by and large, remained unaware of the specifics. But secrets, especially ones this strange, have a way of seeping out. The whispers that had been confined to studio backrooms and the workshops of color men began to find their way into the wider world. The scene shifts to a gentleman's club in Pall Mall. The air is thick with cigar smoke and the rustle of newspapers. Men in comfortable leather armchairs are discussing the news of the day: politics, the stock market, a colonial skirmish in some far-off land. You are sitting near a group of men that includes an artist, a journalist, and a man of science. The conversation is light, but then the artist, perhaps after a second glass of port, tells a story he heard from his color man about a particularly gritty batch of mummy brown. He tells it as a dark joke, an insider's anecdote. But the journalist in the group doesn't laugh. His brow furrows. H.E.S. a writer for a popular weekly magazine like Punch or The Spectator. He centers a story. He begins to ask pointed questions. Do you mean to say, my dear fellow, that the paint is actually made from mummies? The artist, perhaps realizing H.E.S. said too much, becomes evasive. Oh, it's just a name. You know, an old trade name. But the seed of doubt has been planted. The journalist, a man whose profession is to be curious and to expose secrets, is not satisfied with this vague denial. This is how the tide begins to turn, not with a bang, but with a murmur, with private conversations, with growing suspicions, with the slow spread of information from the closed world of the art studio to the more public sphere of journalism and popular science. The mainstream historical narrative often focuses on a single moment of revelation, but the reality is usually a more gradual process of dawning awareness. The journalist starts digging. He talks to other artists. He visits the docks. He may even venture into the grimy workshops of Southwark. He starts to connect the dots between the fashionable Egyptomania, the unwrapping parties, and the innocent looking to buff paint on an artist's palette. He begins to understand the scale of the trade and the brutal reality of the production process. As part of his research, he might uncover some truly obscure and unsettling details. For instance, he might learn that the color and quality of mummy brown could vary depending on which part of the body it was sourced from. A colorman's ledger from the period might contain grimly specific notes like mummy flesh from the thighs, good for rich glazes and lesser quality material from the torso. This level of specific butchery was a part of the trade that was almost never discussed, even among the artists who used the pigment. It was a trade secret that was simply too gruesome to share. The journalist's investigation highlights a point that is still debated among social historians. What was the tipping point for Victorian morality? Why could one generation see a mummy unwrapping as a scientific entertainment, while the next would see it as a barbaric desecration? The change was likely driven by a combination of factors. The rise of more scientific and respectful archaeology, led by figures like Flinders Petrie, who was interested in pottery shards and social history, not just treasure. A growing sense of public empathy, fueled by reform movements. And, perhaps most importantly, the simple fact of the secret being dragged out into the bright, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. Things that are acceptable in the shadows often become monstrous in the daylight. The journalist writes his article. It's published, perhaps under a sensational headline like URIRTISDST, or UESOMES, DCRETIINTPO, RTIITSW, ITHPHARAOHS. The article lays out the whole sordid story, from the tombs of Egypt to the Pauletis of the Royal Academy. It describes the grinding mills. It questions the morality of using human remains for art. It forces the reader to confront the reality behind the pretty pictures in the galleries. The whispers have become a shout. The open secret is now a public scandal. The comfortable ignorance that had protected the users and sellers of mummy brown for so long is about to be shattered for good. The journalist's article lands like a bombshell on the breakfast tables of London. What was once a niche piece of studio gossip is now front-page news. A topic of short conversation in drawing rooms, public houses, and the very galleries where the paintings hang. The public reaction is a tidal wave of disbelief, fascination, and, increasingly, revulsion. You are now in the midst of this public outcry. You can feel the shift in the atmosphere. The romantic allure of Egyptomania suddenly feels tainted. The collector who once proudly displayed a piece of mummy linen on his mantelpiece now quietly puts it away in a drawer. The jokes about mummies at dinner parties are no longer funny. The veil of romanticism and scientific curiosity has been torn away, revealing the crude, industrial process beneath. The public is forced to confront the simple, stark fact their beloved artists were painting with people. The newspapers have a field day. Competing publications rush to follow up on the story, each trying to outdo the other with more lurid details. They print interviews with horrified artists who claim they never knew. They interview color men who try to defend the practice as a long-standing tradition. They print scathing editorials and cartoons. One cartoon might depict a skeleton in a pharaoh's headdress guiding an artist's hand, or a painter squeezing a tube of paint that screams in agony. This public shaming in the press was a powerful force in Victorian society, capable of making or breaking reputations overnight. This is the mainstream historical mechanism of social change in the era trial by newspaper. The scandal creates a moral panic. Sermons are preached from the pulpit, condemning the desecration of the human form, regardless of its age or origin. Questions are asked in Parliament about the unregulated trade in human remains. The public, which had happily consumed the products of the British Empire for decades, was suddenly forced to confront the ugly origins of some of its luxuries. The abstract idea of colonial exploitation became concrete and deeply personal. It was hanging on their walls, in the portraits of their own family members. But what did the artists themselves do? Their reaction was a mixture of defensiveness, denial, and genuine horror. Some, particularly older painters who had used the pigment for decades, likely scoffed at the sudden wave of public squeamishness. They saw it as sentimental nonsense, an overreaction by a public that didn't understand the practical demands of their craft. They might have muttered about tradition and the unique qualities of the pigment, refusing to change their ways. Others were horrified. They were the ones who genuinely had no idea, who had believed mummy brown was just a fanciful name. They felt betrayed by their color men and implicated in a practice they found abhorrent. They were faced with a terrible realization their life's work, the paintings they had poured their souls into, were tainted. The beautiful flesh tones of a beloved portrait, the soulful shadows in a religious scene, all were achieved through an act of desecration. Here you encounter one of the strangest and most specific facts to emerge from the scandal. As the truth became widely known, some artists reportedly became obsessed with the idea that their studios, and even their own bodies, were contaminated. They would scrub their palettes clean, discard any old tubes of brown paint, and some even went through periods of ritualistic washing, as if to cleanse themselves of the taint of the dead. It was a psychological reaction, a manifestation of their guilt and horror at their unwitting participation in the trade. This leads to a fascinating and still debated question for art historians and conservators. Can you see a change in the palettes of artists pre- and post-scandal? Did painters who were known users of mummy brown suddenly abandon it and switch to other pigments like burnt umber or a mix of sienna s in some cases? Detailed technical analysis of paintings from different periods of an artist's career can suggest such a shift. You might see the transparent, warm browns disappear from their work after a certain date, replaced by more opaque, cooler earth tones. However, the evidence is often inconclusive. The change could be due to other factors, like a new aesthetic interest or the availability of new synthetic pigments. Proving that an artist stopped using mummy brown specifically because of the public scandal is difficult, but the circumstantial evidence is often compelling. The scandal has thrown the art world into chaos. The bond of trust between artist and supplier is broken. The relationship between the public and the art they admire is irrevocably changed. The beautiful, serene surfaces of Pre-Raphaelite paintings have been fractured, and now everyone can see the darkness that lies beneath. The age of innocence, or ignorance, is over. The time for choosing sides has come. You can no longer just be an artist, you have to be an artist who knows. The public scandal rages on, But public outrage is a diffuse and general thing. To truly understand its impact, you need to see how it affected a single, sensitive individual. You find yourself in the beautiful, manicured garden of the Grange. The North End Road home of none other than Edward Burne-Jones, one of the leading figures of the second wave of Pre-Raphaelitism. He is an artist renowned for his dreamy, melancholic, and deeply romantic paintings. He is not a man one would associate with ghoulish practices. The year is sometime in the late 1882s or 1892s. After the truth about Mummy Brown has become widely known and discussed, Burne-Jones is in his garden with his family and a few close friends. One of them is a young Rudyard Kipling, whose wife, Caroline, was a niece of Burne-Jones's wife. Kipling, a natural storyteller, would later recount the events of this day, and it is through his memory that we witness this incredible, poignant scene. The conversation eventually turns to the topic that is on every earnest mind in the art world, the Mummy Brown scandal. Perhaps someone asked Burne-Jones if he had ever used the notorious pigment. The artist, a man known for his gentle and somewhat ethereal demeanor, becomes visibly distressed. According to Kipling's account, Burne-Jones admits that yes, he had used it. He had a tube of it in his studio. Like many of his contemporaries, he had likely been unaware of its true nature, or had at least not given it much thought, simply trusting his color man. But now, he knows, the knowledge is a heavy burden. He stands up, his face grim with purpose. "Come with me," he says to his guests. He leads the small group out of the garden and into his magnificent studio. The room is, as you've imagined, filled with the beautiful, otherworldly figures of his paintings, knights, angels, and sorrowful maidens. But today, the artist has no eye for his own creations. He walks over to his paint box, a large wooden case filled with dozens of tubes and bladders of paint. He rummages through it, his movements agitated. Finally, he finds what H.E.S. looking for a single, unassuming tub of paint. He holds it up for his guests to see. On the label, the fateful words Mummy Brown. This is the central, iconic anecdote of the entire affair. It is the moment the abstract scandal becomes a concrete, personal act of conscience. What happens next, as recorded by Kipling, is both touching and slightly absurd. Burne-Jones, holding the tube of paint as if it were a venomous snake, declares that he cannot, in good conscience, keep this thing in his house any longer. It must be disposed of. But how do you dispose of something so tainted? He can't just throw it in the rubbish bin. That seems disrespectful. A continuation of the profane treatment the body has already endured. He decides, with a sense of solemn purpose, that the pigment must be given a proper burial. He leads the small, slightly bewildered procession, which includes the future author of the Jungle Book, back out into the garden. He finds a suitable spot on the lawn, under a flowering apple tree. He takes a garden trowel and digs a small, neat hole in the earth. Then, with a quiet reverence that is in stark contrast to the violent industrial process that created the pigment, he places the tube of Mummy Brown into the ground. He gently pushes the soil back over it and pats the earth flat. He has laid the tiny, metallic coffin to rest. Edward Burne-Jones has just conducted a funeral for a tube of paint. This single act is a perfect encapsulation of the shift in Victorian sensibility. It is deeply sincere, slightly theatrical, and utterly Victorian. It's a private act of atonement. The artist cannot undo the paintings he has already created, the material he has already used, but he can ensure that he will never use it again. He can, in his own small way, restore a measure of dignity to the anonymous Egyptian whose remains ended up in this tube. He is treating the pigment not as a chemical compound, but as a relic, a piece of a person that deserves a final, peaceful rest in peace. Historians still debate the finer details of this story. Did it happen exactly as Kipling described it? Was he embellishing for dramatic effect? It's possible. Kipling was a master storyteller, after all. But the core of the story is widely accepted as true and is consistent with Burne-Jones's sensitive and moralistic character. Whether it was a grand gesture in front of guests or a quiet act performed alone, it represents a profound turning point. The knowledge has been internalized, and it has prompted action. The burial of the painter is more than just a quirky anecdote. It is a symbol of the end of an era. It's the moment when the artistic desire for a specific effect is finally overruled by a moral imperative. The beauty of the color is no longer enough to justify the horror of its source. For Burne-Jones, and for a growing number of his contemporaries, the Faustian bargain was officially off. The symbolic funeral in Burne-Jones's garden was a private act of conscience, but it was a sign of a much larger, public shift. The tide of opinion had turned decisively against Mummy Brown. The scandal had done its work. The demand for the pigment, which had been steady for decades, began to plummet. You are back in the colorman's shop, the one you first visited, with its intoxicating smells of linseed oil and turpentine. But the atmosphere is different now. It's tense. The shopkeeper, who had once proudly recommended the pigment, is now defensive and weary. HES had to face a barrage of difficult questions from his clients. The artists, some were angry, some were horrified, and many simply told him they would no longer be buying the notorious brown. His prized product has become a toxic asset. You watch as an artist, a former regular customer, comes into the shop. He buys some ultramarine blue, a tube of lead white, and a new synthetic pigment, a vibrant viridian. As the color man wraps his purchases, the artist says, pointedly, "And you can take the mummy brown off my standing order, permanently." The color man just nods, his face grim. He has had this conversation many times in recent weeks. The artists, his lifeblood, were boycotting the product. This was the most effective form of protest, not editorials in the paper, but a direct hit to the ledger book. This dwindling demand worked its way up the supply chain. The color men stopped placing orders with the grinders and importers in Southwark. The importers, in turn, saw their market dry up. The grim warehouses, once filled with the raw material from Egypt, began to empty. There was no longer any profit in grinding up the dead. The economic incentive, which had driven this trade for centuries, was finally gone. This brings us to the final, official end of Mummy Brown. The historical record shows that one by one, the major artist supply companies quietly discontinued the pigment. They removed it from their catalogues. If you look at a Winsor Newton catalogue from the 1882s, you will find Mummy Brown listed. If you look at one from the early 20th century, it is gone. There was no grand announcement, no public apology. The pigment just vanished. It became obsolete. The official reason given by the manufacturers was oft unwonderfully, undivisible bland. They didn't say, "We stopped selling it because it was made of people and everyone was horrified." They said something far more neutral. The most common explanation, and the one that became the official epitaph for the pigment, was that they had run out of mummies. The London-based company C. Rossetti & Co., in a rather astonishing claim, was still telling this to inquiring customers as late as the 1960s. Their managing director supposedly remarked, "We might have a few odd limbs lying around somewhere, but we're fresh out of stock." Here you find one of the last, wonderfully weird little facts of this story. In 1964, Time magazine ran a short article about this very claim from Rossetti & Co. The article, titled "The Passing of the Mummy," informed its readers that the pigment was no longer available because the supply of quality mummies had been exhausted. It treats the whole affair as a quirky historical oddity, a sign of how times have changed. The fact that this was newsworthy in the mid-20th century shows just how long the strange legacy of Mummy Brown lingered. But was the claim that they ran out of mummies actually true? This is a point that historians find highly debatable. Was there really a shortage of Egyptian mummies given the sheer number of burials in Egypt? It seems unlikely that the world could literally run out of them. The resource was, for all practical purposes, limitless. The more plausible explanation is that the supply chain had broken down. The political climate in Egypt was changing. The Egyptian authorities, developing their own sense of national heritage, were cracking down on the unregulated export of antiquities. It was no longer as easy to plunder tombs and ship the bodies to Europe. More importantly, the demand had vanished. No one wanted to buy the pigment anymore. So the "we ran out of mummies" line was, most likely, a convenient corporate fiction. It was a face-saving way to discontinue a product that had become a source of profound public embarrassment. It allowed the companies to frame the issue as a simple supply problem, neatly sidestepping the complex moral, ethical, and public relations nightmare that the scandal had created. It was the final, quiet lie in a long history of deception and self-deception. And so, the era of Mummy Brown comes to a close, not with a bang, but with a whimper. A tube of paint is buried in a garden. A name is quietly erased from a sales catalogue. A company director offers a polite, evasive excuse. The pigment that was once a staple on the palettes of the greatest painters of the Victorian age fades into history, becoming a strange and unsettling footnote in the story of art. The story of Mummy Brown seems to end with its discontinuation, a relic of a bygone, more brutal era. But the pigment has a strange afterlife. Its ghost lingers, not in the studios of artists, but in the quiet, climate-controlled laboratories of museum conservation departments. The problem of Mummy Brown is not over. It has simply been passed down to a new generation of professionals, the art conservators. You find yourself in a modern museum, far from the gas-lit world of Victorian London. You are behind the scenes, in the conservation lab. The room is a hybrid of an artist's studio and a science lab. There are easels and brushes, but also microscopes, X-ray machines, and computers running spectral analysis software. A conservator in a white lab coat is standing before a large Pre-Raphaelite painting that has been taken off the gallery wall for examination and cleaning. The painting depicts a scene from Arthurian legend, full of rich, dark, shadowy passages. The conservator is facing a unique set of challenges. This is the main technical problem that Mummy Brown poses in the modern era. When a conservator works on a painting, they need to know exactly what they are dealing with. They need to identify the pigments the artist used to ensure that the solvents they use for cleaning won't damage the original paint layer. They also need to be able to unpaint, or touch up, areas where the paint is flaked off, and to do so, they must match the original color and texture perfectly. With Mummy Brown, this is a nightmare. As you learn it, the pigment was notoriously inconsistent. The color can vary from batch to batch, depending on the specific mummy used, the embalming materials, and the grinding process. So the Mummy Brown in one painting might be chemically and visually different from the Mummy Brown in another painting by the same artist, completed just a year later. There is no single, reliable formula to analyze. The conservator might take a microscopic sample of the paint a flake smaller than a grain of salt and analyze it using techniques like gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. This can help them identify the organic components, the bitumen, the resins, the fats, and confirm the presence of Mummy Brown. But this confirmation is just the beginning of their problems. How do you ret out a color that is no longer made and was famously unstable to begin with? You can't just buy a tube of Mummy Brown hue and expect it to match. The conservators have to become master mimics, using a complex mixture of stable, modern pigments to replicate the unique, translucent, and often slightly gritty appearance of the original. Here's a specific, fascinating detail from the world of conservation. Sometimes, where a painting containing Mummy Brown is X-rayed, strange things can appear because the pigment contains actual ground-up organic matter, including bone. It can sometimes have a different density to X-rays than the surrounding mineral pigments. In some cases, the rare analysis has revealed tiny, radio-opaque fragments that are believed to be specks of human bone embedded in the paint layer. The conservator is literally looking at the skeleton of the painting, a ghostly echo of the person ground into the pigment. This raises an ethical dilemma that is still actively discussed in the conservation community. When a museum discovers that one of its masterpieces contains human remains, what is their obligation? Do they have a duty to inform the public? Should there be a special label next to the painting? Some museums are very open about it, seeing it as an important part of the painting's history and a teachable moment about the past. They might include information on the wall text or in their audio guides. Other institutions are more hesitant. They worry that highlighting the ghoulish origin of the paint will distract from the aesthetic appreciation of the artwork. They fear that visitors will only see the cannibal paint and will be unable to appreciate the artist's skill and vision. They argue that their primary duty is to present the work as the artist intended it, as a work of art, not as a forensic artifact. There is no industry-wide standard, and the decision is often made on a case-by-case basis, reflecting the specific philosophy of the museum and its curators. So the legacy of Mummy Brown lives on in these quiet, ethical debates and complex technical challenges. The conservator, carefully dabbing a tiny brush on the surface of the canvas, is in a direct dialogue with the past. They are grappling with the consequences of the Victorian artist's choices, cleaning up the chemical and ethical mess he left behind. The ghost of the mummy lingers, not as a romantic spectre, but as a complex polymer, a fugitive pigment, and a profound conservation challenge that continues to haunt the museums of the world. As you step away from a conservation lab, with its modern scientific dilemmas, you might be tempted to think that Mummy Brown was a uniquely bizarre and morbid anomaly in the history of art. But the truth is, the world of historical pigments is a veritable cabinet of curiosities. The story of Mummy Brown is just one chapter in a much larger, stranger book. To put it in context, you need to take a brief tour of some of the other weird and wonderful materials artists have used to create color. Your perspective widened. You're no longer focused on a single pigment, but on the entire historical palette. You realize that for most of human history, making color was a messy, often strange, and sometimes dangerous business. Artists couldn't just go to a store, they had to rely on the raw, and often bizarre, materials offered up by the natural world. Let's start with another famous and peculiar pigment you've heard mentioned, Indian yellow. For centuries, European artists' work activated by this intensely vibrant, luminous yellow, but its origin was a closely guarded secret. As you heard, the rumor was that it was made from the urine of cows that were fed exclusively on a diet of mango leaves. This story was so strange that most people dismissed it as a myth. However, in the late 19th century, an investigation confirmed the story was essentially true. The process was cruel to the cows, resulting in malnourished animals, and the practice was eventually outlawed, leading to the pigment's disappearance. So when you look at the glowing, sun-drenched yellows in a painting by J. W. China, you might be looking at the product of a very specific and very strange bovine diet. Then there is cochineal, the source of the most vibrant crimson red for centuries. This wasn't a mineral or a plant, but an insect. Specifically, the cochineal is a tiny scale insect that lives on prickly pear cacti in Central and South America. To produce just 1 pound of the precious red pigment, it took an estimated 70 gyro-dried and crushed female insects. The Spanish controlled the lucrative cochineal trade for centuries after their conquest of the Aztec Empire, and the secret of its origin was a state secret worth a fortune. European artists knew it as carmine, but for a long time, many had no idea they were painting with bugs. The world of pigments is also full of poisons. One of the most beautiful greens of the 18th and 19th centuries was Scheele's green, later reformulated as emerald green. It was a brilliant, vivid green that artists love, but it was made from copper arsenite. It was incredibly toxic. It was used not just in paintings, but also in wallpaper, fabrics, and children's toys. Historians have speculated that Napoleon Bonaparte's death in exile on the island of St. Helena may have been hastened by the arsenical green wallpaper in his damp house, which could have released toxic fumes. Artists who used it frequently complained of illness, and it was a genuinely dangerous pigment to have in the studio. This is a point of debate that expands beyond just Mummy Brown. To what degree were artists of the past aware of the dangers and ethical issues associated with their materials when it came to poisonous pigments like those containing lead, mercury and vermilion, or arsenic? Many artists were certainly aware of the health risks, even if they didn't understand the precise chemical mechanisms. Painter's colic was a known occupational hazard, but did they care for many? Achieving the perfect color was worth the risk. When it came to the ethical origins of something like Indian yellow or cochineal, the awareness was likely much lower. The supply chains were long and shrouded in secrecy. As long as the color was beautiful and effective, most artists simply didn't ask where their carmine came from. Mummy Brown, in this context, starts to look a little less like a complete outlier. It's part of a broader tradition of using strange, organic, and sometimes ethically dubious materials for the sake of art. It's alongside cow urine, crushed insects, and deadly poisons in the historical paint box. What makes Mummy Brown uniquely unsettling to the modern mind is not that it's organic, but that it's human. The use of insects for color might seem a bit gross, but it doesn't cause the same profound taboo. The use of poisons was a risk to the artists themselves, a form of self-sacrifice for their art, but Mummy Brown involved the unwitting sacrifice of others. This tour through the bizarre world of pigments gives you a new appreciation for the clean, synthetic, and safe paints that artists use today. The invention of stable, light first, and non-toxic synthetic pigments in the 19th and 20th centuries was a revolution. It freed artists from their reliance on these strange, unreliable, and often dangerous historical materials. An artist today can use a mummy brown hue, a color created from a safe mixture of iron oxides and other modern pigments that mimics the original, without having to worry about ethics, poisons, or gritty bits of bone. The cabinet of curiosities has been closed, its contents replaced by the predictable certainties of modern chemistry. You've come full circle. You've walked the foggy streets of London, descended into the dusty tombs of Egypt, witnessed the grim workshops and the hallowed studios. You've explored the science, the history, and the ethics of a single, strange color. Now, there's only one perspective left to consider: your own. You're standing here, now, in a quiet museum gallery, armed with this knowledge. How does it change the way you look at art? You are standing once again in front of a magnificent Pre-Raphaelite painting. Let's imagine it's Ophelia by John Everett Millais, the painting you heard about at the very beginning, with the model shivering in the bathtub. It's a riot of natural detail. The lush greens of the weeping willows and the nettles on the riverbank, the deep, dark water, and the pale, tragic face of Ophelia, her hands open in a gesture of release. Her famous red hair floats around her head like a halo. And in the shadows of the riverbank, in the dark, peaty tones of the water, and perhaps even in the glazes on the velvet of her dress, there is Mummy Brown. Before you knew the story, you might have seen this painting as a beautiful, tragic, and romantic image. You would have admired Millais's incredible skill, his truth-to-nature philosophy. You might have felt a sense of pity for the character of Ophelia. The painting would have been a window into another world, a piece of poetic fiction captured on canvas. But now, you see it differently. The painting is no longer just an image, it is an artifact, a physical object with a complex and troubling biography. You can't separate the beauty of the surface from the story of its substance. The truth-to-nature motto of the Pre-Raphaelites now seems deeply ironic. They sought to paint the world with radical honesty, yet their palettes contained a profound deception, or at least a hidden, uncomfortable truth. This raises a fundamental question about art and appreciation. Can art be separated from the conditions of its creation? This is a debate that rages constantly in the art world. Not just about Mummy Brown, but about artists who were known to be terrible people, or art that was funded by blood money, or artifacts that were looted from other cultures. Can a beautiful object transcend its tainted origins? There are a few ways to approach this. One perspective is that of the purist. The art object is autonomous. Its aesthetic value, its form, its color, its composition is what matters. The artist's intent and the historical context are secondary. In this view, knowing about Mummy Brown is an interesting but ultimately irrelevant piece of trivia. It shouldn't diminish your appreciation of Malaysia's genius or the painting's haunting beauty. You should be able to look at Ophelia's face and appreciate the skillful rendering of her expression without thinking about a workshop in Southwark. Another perspective is that of the contextualist. This view argues that art is never created in a vacuum. It is a product of its time and place. And to ignore the context is to have a shallow and incomplete understanding of it. In this view, knowing about Mummy Brown doesn't ruin the painting, it enriches it. It adds a layer of tragic, historical depth that Millais himself may not have even intended. The painting becomes a more complex and powerful object, a testament not only to Victorian beauty, but also to Victorian blindness and colonial exploitation. Ophelia's tragedy is deepened by the silent, anonymous tragedy of the person whose body is literally part of her watery grave. Here's a final, thought-provoking question that historians and philosophers of art still tangle with. Does the artist's knowledge matter? Let's say, for the sake of argument, that we could prove Millais had absolutely no idea about the origin of Mummy Brown. Does his ignorance absolve the painting, or let's say we could prove that he knew everything and used it anyway? Does his cynicism make the painting morally worse, or does the responsibility lie not with the artist, but with the entire system, the color men, the importers, the archaeologists, the colonial government that made such a pigment available in the first place? There are no easy answers. Ultimately, the choice of how to see the painting is now yours. You are the final link in the chain. You can try to block out the story and simply enjoy the sublime beauty on the surface, or you can embrace the complexity, allowing the dark history to inform your viewing, turning your appreciation into a more critical, more thoughtful, and perhaps more melancholic experience. You look at Ophelia floating in the water. Her face is serene, almost peaceful, but the water around her is dull, murky, and full of secrets. It's the perfect metaphor for the painting itself. It is a beautiful surface, but if you look deep into its shadows, you can see the unsettling truths of history swirling beneath, and you realize that this knowledge, as disturbing as it is, has given you a gift. It has allowed you to see beyond the frame, to understand that every work of art is a ghost story, waiting for someone to listen. The museum is closing. The guards are beginning to gently usher the last few patrons towards the exit. The grand halls, once filled with the murmur of voices and the shuffle of feet, are growing quiet. You take one last look at the Pre-Raphaelite gallery. The paintings now sinking into a soft, evening gloom as the lights are dimmed. The journey is over. It's time to leave this world of haunted beauty behind. You step out of the museum and back into the modern city. The air is cool, filled with the sounds of traffic and the distant wail of a siren. The world of Victorian London, of Egyptian tombs and dusty workshops, feels a million miles away. Like a strange dream you are just waking from. But the story lingers. You look at the world around you with new eyes. You see the deep brown of a leather briefcase, the rich color of a wooden door, the earthy tones of a brick building, and for a fleeting moment, you wonder about their substance, their origin, their history. The story of Mummy Brown is, in the end, a story about looking closer. It's about understanding that the beautiful, finished surfaces of our world often hide complex, messy, and sometimes dark origins. The sleek smartphone in your pocket, the cheap t-shirt you're wearing, the coffee you drink in the morning, they all have supply chains, histories, and hidden costs. Just like that above Victorian paint. The names have changed, but the fundamental questions of ethics, exploitation, and willful ignorance remain as relevant as ever. The pigment itself may be gone, but its secco remains. It forced a conversation about the ethics of art materials and the responsibilities of the artist. It contributed to a shift in how Western society viewed the artifacts and human remains of other cultures, a shift that is still ongoing today in the debates about museum repatriation. The mainstream historical takeaway is this Mummy Brown serves as a powerful cautionary tale, a stark example of what can happen when scientific curiosity, artistic desire, and colonial arrogance collide without a strong moral compass. You think back to that first moment in the gallery, when you were captivated by a particular shade of brown. You were drawn in by its beauty, its depth, its seeming gravitas. You were right. It did have gravitas. It had the literal weight of human history ground into its very molecules. The artists who used it were, in a way, trying to paint with time itself. They just didn't fully comprehend the cost of that ambition. Here's one last, strange thought to leave you with. In a way, the story of Mummy Brown is a story of a failed quest for immortality. The ancient Egyptians went to extraordinary lengths to preserve their bodies, to ensure their names and identities would live on for eternity in the afterlife. The tomb robbers and traders dismantled that hope, turning their bodies into an anonymous commodity. But then the artists, in their own unwitting way, granted them a new, strange kind of eternity. The priest from Thebes is gone, his name forgotten, but his physical substance may live on. Captured in the sorrowful eyes of a painted queen, his atoms preserved under a layer of varnish, destined to be gazed upon by strangers for as long as the painting itself survives. It is not the immortality the priest would have chosen, but it is a form of permanence nonetheless. This is a question that historians can't answer, a thought that hovers on the edge of speculation. If that long-dead Egyptian could somehow know their fate, what would they think? Would they be horrified at the desecration, or would they find a sliver of satisfaction in knowing that, while their soul's journey took an unexpected detour, a tiny part of them became a key ingredient in a masterpiece, achieving a bizarre and beautiful form of life after death on a canvas we can never know? The voices of the mummies are silent. All we are left with is the echo, a deep, translucent, and forever haunting shade of brown. The story has ended, but its impressions are settling now, like dust motes in a final ray of evening light. The gallery of your mind is quiet. The intense colors and the dark shadows begin to soften at the edges, blending into the gentle fabric of your encroaching sleep. The characters of this strange history, the artist, the color man, the archaeologist, the tomb robber are receding, their urgent voices fading into a distant, gentle hum. They have played their part on the stage of your imagination, and now they take their bow, retreating behind the velvet curtain of the night. You can feel the weight of your own body, safe and warm in your bed. The journey is over. There are no more tombs to enter, no more dusty workshops to explore. There is only the soft darkness, the steady rhythm of your own breathing. The unsettling questions and the grim realities of the story begin to lose their sharp edges, transforming into the fluid, nonsensical logic of a dream. Perhaps you see a river of color, a stream of brown that flows not with water, but with time. It carries with it the dust of pyramids, the scent of old oils, the glint of a gilded frame. It is not a frightening image. It is just a gentle, flowing current, pulling you peacefully along, deeper and deeper into rest. The history is done. The learning is over. Now, there is only sleep. The end of the article. Good night.